One of the biggest differences that we need to get into Java is how we um, basically define our code slightly different than other languages, and how we call sub procedures, how we deal with data types, a lot of these little things. Rather than giving you a detailed lecture on all these different elements, I'm going to give you a series of quick overviews of some of these ideas. Really kind of focus on the syntax difference and the concept difference, not try and retrain you in how everything works. So considering that, we'll start with the basic statements. So in Java, a statement is generally a variable declaration, an assignment, or a call to a method. They can happen separately. The biggest difference in Java, it's the same as C, different as Python, is Java has a semicolon at the end of every line in general, almost every line, but not absolutely every line. So there's declarations in Java, there's assignments in Java, the single equal is an assignment in Java, and then there's calls to what's called a method. Java doesn't have procedures or functions in general. Java has methods. The main difference is methods are part of objects, and we need an object to call a method. It's possible to get around that, but in that case, we're actually calling it through a class, and so we technically still have an object inside of there. So there's no place in Java where I just say, do this thing, function call, just print, and it just magically prints somewhere. I always need to ask somebody to do something, and we'll talk about that more as we go. Um, so in Java, you have to declare variables ahead of using them pretty much every single time. It's very similar to C that way, but very different from Python because I have to declare it with some data type. The data types have to be known to the compiler and declared in the code very explicitly. I can't just say variable X and maybe it's a string, maybe it's a number, maybe it's a date, who knows. I have to tell it up front. It's going to either be a primitive or a class inside of here, class being a grouping it. Again, we'll talk about that in more detail as you go. Hopefully you're familiar with some aspect of Java object orientation entering this class. So again, primitive or class, and then I give it the name. So the name of it comes after the definition of the class, or the type, I should say. So the variable name, there's not a lot of restrictions on variable names. They typically start with a character. They cannot start with a number. And then in Java, as you see here, we use what's called camel case. That's a standard for with the way Java programmers do stuff. It's not a requirement of the language, though. It's just the way you kind of identify as, hey, this person knows Java. Um, I can give a variable initial value when I define it. So here are my variable pi, 3.14159. It's a kind of a fixed initial value. And technically speaking, Java allows you to put multiple declarations on the same line. Um, Possibly with multiple initial values. They have to be done separately, as you can see here. It's very rare to do that because it generally makes code a little bit less readable. It's easy to hide a variable declaration and not understand where it came from, or maybe they all take the same type, and so sometimes it can be confusing on what that type is, or you can make mistakes. So generally speaking, the rule in Java is you declare them up here, one on each line, even if they're the same type. But it is legal to do this in Java. Um, as I was saying, the valid variable types can either be a primitive, an array, or a class. Arrays are not a class in themselves. They're kind of a special in-between case, and we'll talk about arrays more in a video upcoming. But primitives are things like numbers and booleans and floating point numbers and characters. Everything else pretty much falls into a class, including a string. So Java does not have a character array notion, and there's a very specific distinct type of string versus character arrays. C has that concept as well. In many ways, Java's characters are much easier to deal with. Java's not as flexible with strings as Python, though, in that you have to use double quotes around strings and single quotes around characters. So again, there's always slight little differences, and we'll see them as we go. But this video is kind of just explaining for the knowledge, the dictionary side of your brain, so you understand the concepts as you work through them. Um, One of the rules in Java is you absolutely must initialize a variable before it's used. So if I wrote this code here, I declare the variable sum, and the first line that I put out there is sum is equal to sum plus 1, the compiler is going to give you an error. And that error looks something like this. The variable sum might not have been initialized. It might have been initialized. Sometimes you'll get this error when you are completely convinced it has been initialized, but it's because the logical paths through the code that you wrote do not all result in that thing being initialized ahead of time. Maybe one of those paths is logically impossible to happen, but if Java determines it could happen, then it'll force you to initialize that variable in some way. And it's pretty easy. You can just say sum is equal to 0, or you can change your logic in some way. Or whatever an appropriate initial value, I should say, is. But it is a requirement in Java that every variable has a type and it's initialized before it's used. Now, Java also has constants. In Java, the way you make something constants, you put the word final out there. So C is the word const. I actually don't remember in Python. I don't know if I've done enough Python to make too many constants, but you might be able to remind me on that. But in Java, if I want to make a variable so it doesn't change, like pi, I can set that value, hard code it that way, or the number of days in the week is 7. And then important thing is stylistically alone, but stylistically in Java, if you make a variable final, it's common to make it capital letter names separated with underscores. So that way everybody understands that you can't change this variable. It is a constant value. The interesting thing about constants in Java is you can actually defer when they get assigned. So I could create a constant for a person, for instance, their social security number. Generally speaking, it doesn't change in your lifetime. It's possible, so it's not a perfect example. But the idea is a final variable can be declared just so long as it's only initialized, only assigned one time. So this code would compile and be just fine. If you're an existing citizen, you look it up. If you're not, you get a new social security number. Boom, there you go. So that is a quick view of some of those ideas around variables. I want to talk a little bit. This next idea is not a rule of Java, but more of a style issue because it's important. Like if you go to another country, you want to try and minimize your accent so you don't stand out as being somebody who's not a native speaker or from a different place. You often want to try and adapt the accent so you fit in well. Along those lines, if you want to not code Java with an accent, remember, as we said, the camel case inside there, I want to start every variable with a lowercase letter. And then any word that follows, I follow up with an uppercase letter. And I recommend that you give longer variable names. Instead of saying X, well, what does X mean? The X position? Not X position as in words, but X, the position that in the X coordinate field is what I mean by that. So just try and give a little bit more detail. So instead of just saying customer C, which by the way, I do sometimes when it's very short-lived variable, within a loop or something like that, but especially for attributes, say, what does this customer mean? What's their role inside of here? It's the customer currently being served. For variables, often you name them such that they reflect a question. If the light is on, or if the customer is logged in, that's a way to write your variables. And again, constants are uppercase separated by underscore of variable values inside of there. All right, so there you go, data, Boolean, constants. So that is it for now. We're going to talk more about how to call methods next, and so look forward to that. But again, for now, we're just passing along good information for you to absorb and use as you start to get into your coding.